Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 1st of January 2018. Happy New Year to everybody. In this episode, we're going to address a question that has come up a number of times, and that is, what do all these specs mean that are listed for audio gear? So for microphones, there are a bunch of specs. For mixers, preamplifiers, all these things. And the question is, what do all they mean? What does total harmonic distortion mean? What does output impedance mean? What does load impedance mean? What does all this mean? Well, let me give you a few thoughts that can be helpful, but here are some things that I've learned, and a lot of it I've actually gleaned from a book called the Sound Reinforcement Handbook. If you're not familiar with what sound reinforcement means, first of all, to address that, this refers to PA systems. So when you're doing live sound and there are microphones and maybe instruments, and you are sending that out over a PA system with loudspeakers and a mixer and things of that nature, that is sound reinforcement. This is a book that's actually a classic. This is the second edition. It is a guide that was actually written for Yamaha by Gary Davis and Ralph Jones. It's big, and it's very technical, but it's very useful as well. So I'm not necessarily recommending this as light reading, but it's a great reference. And if you are looking to get into sound a little bit more to the point where you understand a lot of what's going on and you're going to be better at problem solving, things of that nature, this is a great book to have on hand. They do have a section that is entitled Why Ears Don't Always Correlate with Specs. And in short, what they're saying, I think, is that yes, specifications are useful. You can learn some things from them, and they're useful for choosing which equipment to use in which situations. However, they're not the whole picture. And just because you read a set of specs doesn't mean you understand how that piece of audio gear is going to work in terms of producing sound. So let me just read, let me just kind of summarize here. A part of that section, they talk about total harmonic distortion, which is a specification that's often listed. And what that, let me just read the first part here. The very term THD implies a sum, a total of various distortion components. As discussed earlier, the ear finds some harmonics more objectionable than others. Specifically, odd order harmonics, 3rd, 5th, 7th, etc., are more harsh, and even order harmonics, 2nd, 4th, 6th, etc., are more musical to the average listener. Also, higher order harmonics, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, etc., are more noticeable and objectionable than lower order harmonics, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. So what they're kind of saying here is that just because you know the total harmonic distortion, which is a sum of all the distortion across the entire spectrum, that doesn't mean you really understand how good or bad it sounds. So even when you see these specifications for total harmonic distortion plus noise of less than 0.002%, that's great. That's a pretty good specification, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. And so it kind of depends where that distortion falls within the spectrum as to whether or not it's going to be problematic when you're recording or doing sound reinforcement. So that's just one example. Let me just kind of run through a couple of other things here that are useful. I want to talk specifically about impedance, which is a specific question that's come up more often than others when it comes to specifications. And I think a lot of this is based on people that are used to thinking in terms of hi-fi systems, where you have to get the right impedance speakers to go with your hi-fi system. And usually the idea is you want to match them. So you want to match the output impedance of the hi-fi system with the input or load impedance of the speakers. Let's take a closer look here. Matching is not always the goal. In fact, with most modern microphones and preamplifiers, you're really looking to do impedance bridging. So first of all, before we get into that, here's a really good post in a forum by a fellow by the name of Steve Hogan. Steve Hogan designs custom sound systems, mainly preamplifiers. His company is called Alpha Dog Audio. You can see from his website he's more busy working on high-end audio equipment than he is on websites, which is good. But he wrote something that was really interesting. So he wrote about this question of, hey, what impedance microphone do I need to get to work with this input or load impedance preamplifier? And these are specs that you'll see again on mixers, preamplifiers, recorders, and you'll also see output impedance on microphones. So here's what he says overall. Again, the goal is mainly not so much to match impedances these days, but more to bridge impedances. So he says for bridging load, as a rule of thumb, an output source is considered to have a bridging load or to be bridged when the load impedance, that's the input impedance on the preamplifier or recorder or mixer, is greater than or equal to 10 times the source impedance. Source impedance is the microphone's output impedance. Thus, a mic preamp with a 1500 ohm input impedance will present a bridging load to a microphone with 150 ohm output source Z. Z means impedance. Such a load will cause the signal voltage to drop minus 0.83 decibels instead of the minus 6 dB that occurs with a matching load. A bridging load improves the signal level 5.17 decibels over the matching configuration. A 5 dB improvement in signal-to-noise ratio is definitely worthwhile. If all this seems hopelessly complicated, be of good cheer. One does not have to understand all the engineering details to understand how it all interacts. If you understand the principles of how the microphone and its output source impedance can interact with a preamp and its complex input impedance, you may be able to make decisions on interfacing which improve your recordings. And so I'll stop right there. So I think what he's saying overall is really what you're looking for is to have the load impedance or the input impedance on your recorder or mixer or preamplifier to be 10 times higher than the output impedance on your microphone. That's probably the simplest way to think of it in those terms. And if you do that, then you will get a better signal-to-noise ratio and you'll get a stronger output signal. So in the overall signal chain. So that's generally what you're going to be looking for as far as the impedance specifications are concerned. Generally, there are exceptions to the rule, but that's the main idea. So that was one thing I wanted to talk about. Now, let's take a closer look at a couple things here. Now, just to, there's also, I'll link to all of these things. So here's also an article on impedance bridging, which is available over on Wikipedia if you want to get into more of the details. Let's look at some specifications for a few microphones. Here is the Shure CMC6U. This is a microphone preamplifier. In essence, it's the body of the Shure CMC641, which is a very common production supercardioid microphone. It shows an output impedance of 35 ohms. It's actually exceptionally low. You'll notice here it says the minimum recommended load impedance, that is the impedance or the input impedance on your preamplifier or mixer or recorder. Here they recommend 600 ohms. This is actually fairly unique. Oftentimes you will not see this specification with microphones, but they actually went out and said, hey, you should probably be using a preamplifier with a load impedance or input impedance of 600 ohms or greater. Just for comparison, here is a more consumer-oriented microphone. This is the Rode NTG2, and its output impedance is spec'd at 250 ohms. So what that would mean in practical terms is for the best performance, you probably want to use a preamplifier that has an input or load impedance of 2,500 ohms or greater to get that bridging impedance match. Or it's not actually a match, it's a bridge. Here's the Rode NTG3, a more expensive, more professional grade microphone, output impedance 25 ohms. Let's look over here at inputs or preamplifiers, audio interfaces, mixers, things of that nature. So I'm going to drop down here to the tech specs. You can see here its load impedance or input impedance is 3,000 ohms. So that would work great even with the Rode NTG2. And again, this one is their Scarlett line. So this is kind of their entry line of audio interfaces for computers. Scarlett Solo in that case. Here is a live mixer. So this is made for sound reinforcement. It's an analog mixer by a company called Soundcraft. And it actually specs its mic input at 1.2 kilo ohms or 1,200 ohms. Now that's interesting. I would actually be somewhat potentially concerned about this. And it's interesting as I read the reviews, I've never heard this preamplifier. As I read some of the reviews, some people did complain about audio quality issues. They didn't give all the details on which mics they were using. But that's a little bit on the low side. So that it's not a deal breaker, but I would do more research before investing in something like that. Here is the specifications on one of Allen and Heath's digital mixers, namely the SQ5, which is their newest generation digital mixer. By digital mixer, I'm not. It actually has analog inputs, of course, but it's more complicated than that. And actually, we're going to take a closer look at this one. I have one of these on the way here. This has an input impedance on its microphone inputs of greater than 5,000 ohms. That one should be able to handle most microphones. So overall, I hope that was helpful. Just the kind of the short story, the upshot, if you will, is that specifications don't always tell the whole story. It's important to understand how they work. I think especially impedance, because that actually is related to the noise performance, and it is also related potentially to total harmonic distortion or harmonic distortion. So I think making sure that you get that impedance right between your microphones and your recorder is probably one of the biggest steps and more important things to understand. So that's the first step at answering that question. I hope that's helpful for you. If you have any other questions, go ahead and leave those down below. I'll do my best to answer those. And we've got a great community here that oftentimes can answer them, even if I can't. Hope you have a great, happy new 2018, and we'll talk to you again next week.